Now, you might wonder why I'm doing pastel pencil over watercolour instead of over pastel. Well, I prefer to keep that dust down, as I've mentioned. And so by doing a lovely background in watercolour and then coming on with either my soft pastel or my pastel pencils, I've got the beauty of the pastel with minimal use of it and therefore minimal dust. But you can do the whole painting using pastels, starting with your hard pastels and coming up gradually to the very softest. Now, if you're using the extremely soft stick pastels, you'll find it harder to use the pastel pencils on top. So if you like a lot of detail, then pastel pencil is great. So if you're doing the hair in animals, you might like to get the square stick pastels, which are harder than the round pastels, to put down your initial harder background so that the pastel pencil then is softer by comparison. Whereas if you're using your round, very soft pastels, particularly say schminky, you'll find that it's harder to get your pastel pencil to work well over them. You can, of course, make sure that background is very light, very thinly put on, so that your final coat will go on more easily. But always, as I said, working with the hardest first and the softest last will work best for you. If you are using pan pastels, they tend to be soft, but if you put them on very thinly, you can get your pastel pencils over the top of them. But you the technique for using pastels is quite different. You tend to find that you pick up the pastel with an applicator, and a lot of people prefer that to holding the pastel stick in the hand because it's cleaner. But you have to dip in and maybe dip in about 3 times to pick up enough of the pastel pan powder, and then you push it down onto your paper. Now, the paper mustn't have too textural a surface or it'll damage your sponge. So you want a slight texture, not heavy texture, and certainly not rough texture like a sandpaper type of coating, because that will grip your delicate sponge and rip it to shreds very quickly. So to get maximum use of the applicator, you need just a little bit of texture. Actually, the paper that I'm working for this work, which is a textured watercolour paper, would be ideal. And you would, as I said, pick up sufficient of the pan pastel, and then you would press it down firmly onto your paper and then slide it along and lift off. Now, you may find you can do about 2 strokes, but then you need to go back and reload. So it's sort of like dip, 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 push down on the paper, slide, dip, 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 push down on the paper, slide. Yeah, as I said, you may get 2 slides in. Very rarely will you get 3 slides in of your pastel. So you're constantly reloading. And to me, as an artist, I would find that tedious. A lot of crafters love it. People who are doing greeting cards, card makers, they love the pastel pans more than the artists who are used to doing large works with big generous brushes. I've shown you the watercolour brushes that I've used at the start of this series of tutorials for this beautiful snow rose, and I use this beautiful big mop brush of natural hair Pettigrew's Pearl that holds a huge amount of wash, and I can load that up with colour and sweep it across into huge areas of the painting without going back to reload. Now imagine me trying to do that with pan pastels, going dip, 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 push down on the paper, sweep, dip, dip, dip. That would drive me nuts. It would just take away all the freedom and spontaneity of painting. So I would be far happier using a lovely fluid medium like the watercolour. Even the soft pastel sticks I would prefer, because I've got that stick in my hand and I would keep on working with it, and my nature is that once I've completed working in an area, I look for where else that colour or tone belongs, and I would continue on before I would go and pick up another stick, so I'd be just working happily away painting. So in other words, with the mediums I'm working on, I'd be focusing on the painting, whereas with your pan pastels, I'd be focusing on going dip, 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 down, and constantly going backwards and forward to that little pan and reloading it. So that's part of the reason why the pan pastel isn't for me. Now, that's not saying they're not fabulous. There are artists who love them. I know because I've had family member who was in the crafts business, the card making business, and they absolutely treasured their pan pastels. It was probably one of their most favourite art mediums, but they're working on tiny little cards, greeting cards, whereas I want to work on a decent size, canvas or paper. So that's my feelings about the pan pastels. I'm not going to invest in them. I'm very, very happy with all the mediums that I've got now. But try them if they interest you. You don't have to buy full sets, which might cost a few $100s. You can just buy a couple of colours. Actually, I believe there are some good specials going in some shops, because a lot of shops are actually going out of the pan pastels because a lot of artists have reported the same experience that I've got. They either love them or they hate them, and there's a lot of artists who are already entrenched in working with the brush and loving to work big and broad and freely, and they're like me and they're saying, no, we don't want the tediousness of constantly going back, loading this little applicator, which is a little bit like a makeup application brush. Anyway, as I said, I have done paintings that are all done with pastel from the start through, and then I've done a lot of paintings where I start off with maybe watercolour or gouache on the textured paper, and then I finish off with pastel. And I'm going to do more work with pastels that way, because that's cutting back on the dust. That's still getting the beauty of the pastel, but that original block in on the paper, it can be done with a medium that has no dust, that will simply soak into the paper and be quite permanent. And also the painting will, I don't have to put fixatives down. It's got less that's going to come off the paper if it's roughly handled. So that's my preference. As I said, I'll do some works that are fully pastel. I'm really looking forward to my next works that are coming up. I'm actually going to do some portraiture, not up close portraiture. I'm doing some ladies in a rose garden, and it's been something that has been in the planning stage for a few months now, and I drafted them out last night. I've probably drafted out about half a dozen. I'll paint at least one of them in oil paints. I'll probably do one in all pastels, and I'll definitely do some in watercolours and finish them off in the pastels, or do it purely in purest watercolour. So they are coming up in my future demonstrations, and I am looking forward so much, because it's family members, people I love. And that's a big secret in doing good work, is to love what you're doing and paint what you love.